Welcome to the Create What You Speak podcast. Join me as we have a real-life discussion on how to change your life by changing your thoughts. Remember, question everything, trust yourself, and find your truth. Welcome to the Create What You Speak podcast. My name is Sloan Fremont, and I'm your host. Today, my guest is Arthur Yavelberg, and he's the author of a book, A Theology For the Rest of Us. And I love how Arthur describes his book because he talks about wanting to show the readers that religious responses to spiritual questions can be quite rational and even empowering. So I know this topic of religion can bring up a lot of things. It brings up things for me if I allow it. But I think you'll find in our conversation today, we're not talking about religion in a way that you have to believe this or you have to believe that. And Arthur's book is definitely not anything like that. It's not anything about telling someone they should follow a particular religion or go this way or that. Really, the basis of his book is being able to share what he has learned so that people can really use this information and come to their own conclusions. And you'll hear me talk in this interview how I felt like after I read this book that I sort of felt spiritually stuck. Like religion did not appeal to me, but I still wanted to grow spiritually. And I felt like after reading Arthur's book that I understood where I could go next. I understood how I could take bits of what worked for me and use it in my own life instead of having to feel like I needed to prescribe to, one way of being. So I think you're going to find this interview not only interesting, but very beneficial as a stepping stone on your spiritual journey. So if you're a seeker, as I imagine you are, if you're listening to this show, I think that this episode is you're going to find that you're going to come out on the other side of this, having a greater understanding of spirituality, of religion, however you want to describe it, maybe even a different view of God, divine intelligence, again, whatever word you want to use to define that for yourself. There's something for everyone in this episode. And so I really hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy talking to Arthur. Joining me today is Arthur Yavelberg, author of the book, A Theology For the Rest of Us. As opposed to typical comparative religion or evangelical texts, A Theology for the Rest of Us draws on a variety of Eastern and Western religious traditions, as well as science and literature, to guide people so they can come to their own conclusions as to spirituality and their purpose in life. Arthur, I want to welcome you to the Create What You Speak podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So let's start out by telling the audience just a little bit about yourself and what led you to write your book, A Theology for the Rest of Us.
Well, I was a teacher, a school administrator for a good 40 years. There's something very exciting about dealing with middle school students in particular because they have a lot of questions and they don't take anything for granted or simply because you say so. Mm-hmm. So that whole approach of answering questions and exploring questions with students is something that's pretty familiar with me. In terms of the issues in the book, I have to say, I grew up in a very, not a particularly religious household. My father was a devout atheist. I didn't believe in anything that you couldn't point to and measure and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And my mother was very superstitious. My father was born in Canada and my mother was Mexican and her English was very poor. So as a result of that, one of these unintended consequences, I found myself in the position of having to explain things to her about American society. I had been to school in the United States and things like that in ways that she could understand. And the connection might not seem so obvious, but that necessity of explaining things is something that came up in school as well as with other people. Mm-hmm. In terms of the issues themselves, these are things I had thought about for years and years. I don't know if your listeners or audience remembers, but there was this Kung Fu show with David Carradine way back when. I found it absolutely fascinating. And then there was King of Kings with Jeffrey Hunter, who I later found out played Christopher Pike in the pilot for the Star Trek, the original Star Trek show. And I was just mystified by it. I just found it entrancing. And, the Hindus have this thing that, that which you are seeking is causing you to seek. And I look back on those things and I say, you know what? This can't have been an accident because this is what basically started me thinking in not only religious terms, but in unconventional religious terms. It
Right.
wasn't filtered by the church or synagogues or anything like that. It was purely me. And that I think guided a lot of the approach.
Yeah. Before we get into the book, I want to touch on one other thing about your background, because when I was reading about you, you have an extensive background, as you mentioned, in teaching, but also in traveling, because you've been able to see the world in a different way, I think, than most people. Can you tell us about some of those experiences you had and how they led to maybe to parts of the book, and how you're able to talk about this?
Yeah, I got to tell you, what you see with me is pretty much what you get. There's nothing special about me, and people who know me, for me, I go out and play in chess tournaments and things like that. So I'm not an adventurer or anything like that. For someone like me to have the opportunity to work in Singapore for a couple of years, I joke about it, but I didn't even know what Singapore was. I thought Singapore and Shanghai and Hong Kong, it was all basically the same place, just in different languages.
Right.
And yet I find myself with this opportunity to work in Singapore. And from Singapore, it's much easier to travel to Japan and China and Thailand. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is an unbelievable religious complex of buildings that have been around for so many years. Mm-hmm. And you meet the people who are involved and engaged in living the life of these people. In the United States and in the West, a lot of religion is compartmentalized. Right. I go to church on Sunday, or I celebrate Christmas, or I go to synagogue, or whatever it is, but it's compartmentalized. Whereas, no, in the East, it's very much a day-to-day practice. And you'll walk down the street and you'll see these individual shrines that people have set up, whether it's Hindu or Taoist or things like that, within the neighborhoods, and people go on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. So, for me, and I'm a pretty rational guy, it's hard for me to believe that this opportunity and these opportunities were purely coincidental, random forces in the universe. I could easily imagine God saying, Arthur's interested in this stuff. He's got to get out to the Far East. But you know how he is, it's got to be safe. It's got to be easy, all this kind of stuff. Right. And sure enough, everything falls into place. If not, I don't go. Right.
Well, and you said yes to the opportunity too.
Correct. But it made it very easy for me. I was looking, knowing at me as I do, I was looking for reasons to say no, and I couldn't find
it. Right. I'm that way too on a lot of things. Well, and so this experience in this, and one of the things I really loved about your book is that clear explanation of how things are in the East versus how things are in the West. I grew up in a Catholic household. It was more, to me, it always felt like it was just an activity you did. I didn't understand why I was there most of the time. I didn't know these words that we were supposed to recite. I didn't understand why we stood and kneeled and stood and kneeled. But my ultimate question, I remember asking my parents about this. I asked this in Sunday school, and I always got in trouble for this question. But I'd never understood, why is this religion supposedly inferior to the others? Superior. Not inferior. Superior. Why is this religion superior to the others? Like, I don't understand that. I have friends who don't come to this church. So does that mean they're bad for some reason, or there's something wrong? And I tried to, as a child, I remember trying to rationalize this and trying to understand. And I never, because there isn't one, but I never got a clear understanding of why that was. And it even seemed like people were mad that I was even asking the questions.
Well, they're mad at you for asking the questions because they're repressing their own questions along those lines.
Right.
So they value security and stability. So if somebody like you comes along who questions these things, if you have a case, then they have to start acknowledging that they have questions too, and that undermines everything. So this is not, the fact that people got angry and upset with you is not, surprising, honestly, at all. I do try to work within the religious thinking. So to answer your question, even though I'm not a Catholic, a lot of it depends on how you understand some of the text. So, for example, when Jesus says, "None may approach the Father except through me," it's easy to look at that and say, well, this is the only way. And especially if you grow up in a monotheistic society where, the first commandment, thou shalt not have any other gods before me.
Right.
It's easy to draw the conclusion that, this is only one way and this is it. A more sympathetic understanding of it, though, is that I think in terms of schools, it's not that, high school is better than second grade, but it is more sophisticated. The knowledge and understanding are a little bit better. So I think a more sympathetic understanding of this superiority. In Islam, for example, Islam recognizes the legitimacy of the people of the book, whether it's Judaism or Christianity. But in Islam, they simply say, but Muhammad's the last of the prophets, and Allah is the clearest and the best understanding of what the deity is. So it's more of a progressive thing. And he's Catholic, you have people like Richard Rohr who will come along and they will distinguish between Jesus and Christ. So he will say, for example, and he's a Catholic monk. He will say that Jesus, the name, refers to historical personality in a particular point in time in a particular geographical location, but the Christ is universal. Mm-hmm. That's everywhere, and everybody can access it and has accessed it in different ways depending on culture and time and circumstances and all those kinds of things. So to be Catholic sounds like it means something, but it really doesn't unless you fill in the context of what it means to be Catholic. And you can say that about just about any religion, whether it's Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish or whatever. There are those people who only feel secure if they have the one and only answer, and it's us or it's them.
Yes.
And, that's where they are, and that's what they can do, and that's what they can handle, and God works with everybody at their own pace. But there is, and this is part of the point of the book, there are alternatives. And we cut ourselves off from potential supporters and kindred spirits if we simply, focus in some kind of tunnel vision on one thing which we grew up with or whatever.
Right. Right. And, that is with your book, that's what one of the big things I felt I walked away with, because I did feel in my own spiritual life that I was cut off in many ways, because religion to me, the building and the people that make up that and make up various rules and things, that is something I have not been interested in for a very long time. However, I am still a spiritual person and I want to grow in that area of my life. But I felt like I didn't know where to go with that because of these things like I talked about, like how I grew up, my experiences I had, the general confusion around it, because I wasn't sure. Again, I wasn't sure where to go with it. And I felt like after I read your book, I felt like it opened up something for me where now I understood where I could take some next steps. Whereas before I felt blocked and I felt maybe even like turned off or like, I can't, no, I don't want to even consider that because of past experiences I had. And even, I would say even past confusion I had about things because, as I mentioned, things just never added up to me. And you even mentioned this in your book about your being able to go with your own sense of reason as well, right? And there's a lot of things that didn't reasonably make sense for me. So walking away after reading your book, and I was telling you this before we started recording, how there was a lot of times the way you explained things was in such a way that I had never heard it explained that way, but it made so much sense to me that I would be like, huh. And I'd have to actually get up and walk away from the book and digest it and see what that meant for me. So I could get that point before moving on to the next part of the book. And that's one of the things that I really loved about this was I walked away from your book under having a completely different I don't want to say completely, but a different enough, perception of spirituality / religion that I felt like I could use it. I felt like I knew what to do next rather than feeling so confused and like I'm stagnant or not growing in that area.
Well, the best word, as I said before, the best word I keep hearing you say is I. Mm-hmm. I got up and I thought about and I did this and I did that. And as opposed to saying a different perspective, it sounds like you're coming up with your perspective.
Right.
In other words, you're not